Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. Shifting alliances. Washington's unrelenting policy assault against Russia and China has already altered the world order. What remains to be seen is how Moscow and Beijing will work together to confront a hostile West. Also, will America ever be normal again? To discuss some real news, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. And in Budapest, we have George Samueli. He is an author and a YouTuber at The Gaggle. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. All right, let's go to London. Marcus we've been watching over the last few years a closer relationship between Moscow and Beijing. And as a matter of fact, a couple of days ago, when asked about a potential military alliance, which these two countries do not have right now, but its possibility, Putin said this, the Russian president: theoretically, it's quite possible to imagine it. Without any doubt, our cooperation with China is bolstering the defense capacity of China's army. Time will show how it will develop. We can't exclude it. We've never heard this before from the Russian president. What's changed? Go ahead.
In a period of 5 decades, Russia and China have gone from the brink of war with each other, which could have involved nuclear weapons, to a situation today where both countries have formed an informal strategic partnership with one another to stem American global mastery. Now, given that 5 decades is, in relative terms, a very short period of time, the turnaround in relations between Moscow and Beijing is quite simply astonishing. However, I am of the opinion that the relationship between Russia and China is not one of affinity, it is one of necessity. Both countries need each other to prosper in a world in which America remains the overall supreme power. Now, I do not foresee any reason why the informal strategic partnership between Russia and China will break down in the foreseeable future. But there are serious challenges to that relationship. And these challenges are only ones that people in Washington and London have become familiar with in recent times. So, for example, China is continuing to try and undermine Russia's predominance in Central Asia, and that will become all the more so once China launches its One Belt initiative. And then you have Russia's very close relationships with India and Vietnam, which is a very serious concern for China, because India and Vietnam are two very potential adversaries of China, and China could very easily become embroiled in a war with both of those countries. Then you have China's very close relationship with America, which gives a lot of concern to the Kremlin. And so we also have to take into consideration the military relationship. Now, I'm very aware of what President Putin said, but I'm not so sure he really believes that there will be a military alliance, because the Russians are very sensitive and concerned about supplying high-tech components to the Chinese military, because many in the Kremlin are concerned that by doing so, Russia could be building up a military force in China that one day could threaten the national security of the Russian Federation. Now, all that said, I see the relationship between Russia and China continuing to blossom in the future, but there are very serious challenges to it.
You know, George, in Budapest, it didn't have to be this way. This wasn't an inevitability here. This relationship, we can put whatever adjective you want to put in front of it, but this is basically the makings of Washington. I mean, and they did it with eyes wide open. Go ahead, George.
Yes, without question. What has happened since the end of the Cold War has been the massive expansion of NATO, something that the Russians repeatedly warned they considered an existential threat. The United States withdrawing from key military agreements with Russia. most recently from the INF Treaty, but before that from the ABM Treaty. Now also they're planning to withdraw from the Open Skies Agreement. And now, you know, it could be that the New START Treaty is also for the history books. So that's one thing. But the other thing, which is of real concern for Russia, is the level of vitriol that is directed toward Russia, and not from ordinary people, from the tabloid press, but from the very highest levels of the US government. We're talking about the people who are in the executive branch, the people who are in Congress, and of course you have the media stoking this. So when you have the absence of any arms agreement, a possible arms race developing, plus this extraordinary hostility, yes, then Russia does feel threatened and is obviously drawn towards China. Now, China also feels very threatened because it is gradually replacing the United States as the global hegemon. They have enormous economic and financial power, and never in history has one hegemon quietly ceded its role in the world to a rising hegemon. And given the hostility that's now emanating towards China from the Trump administration, now Biden is actually saying that Trump has been too soft on China. So it's quite obvious that some sort of a serious conflict between the United States and China is likely in the very near future. So you can see why both Russia and China, for existential reasons, are increasingly drawn towards each other. And what Putin was saying was that this is a real possibility. He's not saying that it's going to happen tomorrow, but that it's a real possibility. So, you know, be careful.
Yeah, I mean, that's, Marcus, that's exactly how I read it, is that, you know, it's on the table and it is negotiable and it depends on external factors. And I think that that was just kind of basically putting up the flag on the pole and seeing if anybody salutes. And it is actually also a warning, okay, because there's this ridiculously held concept in the West is that Russia is just begging to join the American coalition, and you know, and it's this part of this American exceptionalism. If you just listen to us and do what we say, everything will be fine. Well, the Russians know that's not true, and the Chinese certainly know that's not true. As a matter of fact, now China's on the receiving end of what Russia's been on the receiving end for years. Go ahead, Marcus.
Oh, absolutely, Peter. You know, gone are the days when Russia sought integration with the West. And I'm talking about in the early days of Vladimir Putin's tenure in power. Now, that is long gone. Russia today is striving to achieve its full potential in the world. And Russia understands acutely that in order for it to achieve its full potential, then it really does have to seek strategic alliances around the world. And that is one of the main reasons why Russia has formed this unofficial strategic partnership with China. And it is certainly the case that a military alliance between Moscow and Beijing is possible, but unless those challenges to the relationship, which I outlined moments ago, are resolved, then that military alliance simply will not happen. And it is also the case that there is talk in Washington and London that the Americans could attempt what Richard Nixon attempted and indeed actually achieved, to draw China away from Russia, as Nixon drew China away from the Soviet Union. And I referred earlier to how China has a very, very heavy relationship with America. That is one way the Americans could achieve disrupting the relationship between Moscow and Beijing. Now, I don't see that happening in the foreseeable future. But anything is possible. But the challenges between Russia and China really have to be resolved. And in regard to India and Vietnam, Russia is putting itself forward to all of the parties concerned as a mediator, as a bridge, because Russia is telling China, India, and Vietnam that unless we resolve, or unless yourselves resolve the differences, then who is going to benefit? It is going to be America. But alas, Russia acting as a mediator has not worked so far because China and India nearly came to blows earlier this year. There were border clashes. Tension is growing between China and Vietnam, and the Chinese know that if a war breaks out between China and India or China and Vietnam, Chinese soldiers will die, and they will die at the hands of Russian-made weapons, and the Russians are arming to the teeth India and Vietnam. So I do hope that this challenge can be resolved.
Yeah, but I think that given the case of having the difficulty of resolving these issues, these are very clear here. But the other gambit is to trust Washington, and I don't see that's possible. I think that George, I saw you nodding your head. I mean, the thing is that the American politics is at a point right now where Russia is just a cudgel to fight your internal enemies. Okay, so I can't see how this is going to change very much, and I think the Chinese have actually learned that too, watching how Washington has treated Moscow, and it's a real primer, because all of the issues that Marcus just brought up, it's probably easier to deal with those issues than to deal with an administration in the United States. George.
Yeah, no, without question, Peter, because this kind of talk that comes from Washington about how, well, we should now maybe tilt towards Russia against China, just as Nixon tilted towards China against the Soviet Union. It's just hogwash, because after so many years of unremitting hostility toward Russia and serious threat toward Russia, you can't just turn around and say, oh, well, we'll be bygones, and now please join us in some kind of a global coalition against China. I mean, the Russians aren't stupid. They know perfectly well that essentially what's behind this is a kind of let's you and him fight. They're going to try and push Russia into a war with China, and then the Americans can just sort of sit back. Boy, this is a really bad conflict going on here. So no, I think that's just that train left the station a long time ago. But I do think that the China conflict with India and China conflict with Vietnam, while real, are I think much less urgent right now than the conflict with the United States. I mean, that's a serious one, because here you get the United States, which is really now very concerned about its role in the world. I mean, this has not happened. We're talking now about since 1945. No one has challenged the United States' supremacy in the world. I mean, yes, the Soviet Union did when it came to nuclear arms, but in terms of economics, finance, geopolitical influence, the Soviet Union could never rival the United States. China is now in a position to do that.
Okay, George, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, let me go back to Marcus in London. Pat Buchanan, an author I often cite on this program, came out with another brilliant column last couple of days titled "America, a Land of Ceaseless Conflict." And he ruminates about the illusion that some people have in the political class, media class in the United States, is that once Trump's gone, everything is going to go back to normal. Everything will be quiet. And even, Joe Biden said on the campaign trail, nothing will fundamentally change. These people don't know what they're talking about, because the rift that is going on in American politics and culture is so deep. The abyss is so deep that I think that what happened in the Trump administration is this reflection of those divisions. He didn't create those divisions, irrespective of how you feel about Trump. So going back to normal, that's an illusion, Marcus. What do you think?
America is not, for want of a better word, a normal country. Firstly, it was born out of genocide. Secondly, and the factor I'm going to cite now might be distasteful to a number of people, and in particular neoliberals, but quite frankly, I'm not interested in what they think. But America is not a nation state. And that means America has never truly had an identity. America has never truly had a culture. Whilst most of the largest groups, ethnic groups in America, are Northern European, for example, English, German, Scottish, Scots-Irish, and Irish. There are many other ethnic groups there. If you take Australia and America have a, relatively speaking, similar length period of history. There is more of an Australian national identity and culture and unity than there is in America. Why? Because the vast majority of Australians descend from the British Isles, in particular England. But in America, you do not have that sort of harmony. So that is a major problem. We hear a lot of liberals in America talking about how America is a successful melting pot. Well, it would be nice if everyone in the world was united, but that is not how human beings have evolved. Human beings have over thousands of years evolved into tribes. That is the way it is. That is the way it always will be. And indeed, Vladimir Putin once asked rather rhetorically, does America actually have a culture? And I would say it doesn't, because America is not a nation state. That is why America will always be divided, no matter who sits in the...
Yeah, but you can make the argument too that it is a nation state of multiple tribes. Okay, and I think that that's a viable argument to make here. But George, you know, to my point here, I mean, these divisions have been with us for a very long time, and one of my favorite mantras, as you well know, is that, you know, the neoliberal ideology that is practiced and forced down on everyone. It does argue about what culture means, what American culture means, but they refuse to talk about class. And that is the biggest division, okay? You know, Black Lives Matters, you know, Antifa, you know, or abortion, you know, these are the things they do to keep us divided. And I would be willing to say, and Trump saw it very differently, and it's up to our viewers to decide how successful he has been. But, you know, the class issue is what got him elected, and that's an issue that could get him reelected if he were focused on it. But at this late day in the game, I don't know if he's going to be able to overcome that. But, you know, Joe Biden said, you know, nothing will fundamentally change. Well, that's the problem. Things need to fundamentally change, okay? Because the next Republican after Trump, if it's in 4 years or 8 years, it's going to be somebody that's going to be like Trump, but probably far more effective in office. Go ahead, George.
Yes, that's right. Now, the problem with the United States, you know, to be a functioning democracy, it means that there is a consensus, and there's a consensus about the succession of power. I mean, what happened in 2016, and I think at least in terms of modern history, this has never happened, which is one class simply refused to accept that election result. Well, when that happens, of course, then you've got the makings of a civil war, because whichever way this election goes, it's almost certainly going to be a very close one. And it's very unlikely that either side will accept that election result. Should Trump be reelected, then those who have been rioting all of this year, plus the sort of the media allies who have been justifying the violence, with Antifa, the Black Lives Matter, they will be in support. They will support the violence, and they will just simply refuse to accept Trump's reelection. Whether they blame Russia for it, or they'll find something else. They'll blame the October surprise, Trump or Trump's allies bringing up this laptop. They will blame that, and almost certainly within days of Trump being inaugurated, Nancy Pelosi's House will launch an impeachment, yet another impeachment. If it goes the other way, if Biden wins, and particularly after we're going to have these elections where we're going to be counting and counting and counting for weeks on end, and suddenly, whoa, Biden has won, we've got the votes, then I think that there'll be a real burst in the growth of the militant movement. And as happened in the 90s, it's quite likely that a US administration will likely try to crack down on the militant movement. If it ends in the kind of bloodshed as happened in Waco in 1993, then, then there's really going to be violence, a very serious insurrection that the government may well not be able to cope with, because
even the government
Americans don't really like. Look what happened in Waco. I mean, Waco.
Yeah, but the government itself could be divided. Okay, that's the point. Marcus,
Exactly.
maybe a topic for another program. I think there is American culture, but I mean, probably think about it differently, being an American, I suppose. But I mean, one thing that, for a viable nation state, you have to have institutions where there is a consensus that these institutions have legitimacy. Kind of picking up from what George just said there, these institutions do not have universal legitimacy, and that is the problem right here. People don't believe in the electoral outcomes anymore. Okay, they don't believe that the state is going to enforce protection of their rights. We've seen, and it depends on what your political creed is. I mean, you can land on one side of the law, and if you have a different creed, you're on another side. Okay, and it's basically liberals that take care of themselves. And perfect example, people in Trump's orbit being indicted and things like this. The legitimacy of the system, as they say, is in doubt. And this election is going to show it. Go ahead, Marcus.
Yes, I concur with that, Peter. What binds a society together is a dominant culture. That is absolutely crucial for ensuring a harmonious existence within a society. But I absolutely accept that there are many other factors which can be cited to account for why American society historically is divided. And as you correctly cited, Peter, class is a major factor behind that. And that is something that neither the Democrats nor the Republicans are taking into account, though of course deep down I suspect they know it's the case. That leads me on to my next point. I believe that if there is to be a realistic chance, a realistic opportunity of creating a far greater degree of harmony in American society, then there has to be the emergence of another political party in America, one that is truly independent, one that does not have ties to various lobby groups, be it the military-industrial complex, to the big pharmaceutical companies, foreign policy, such as Israel and Saudi Arabia. Then, only then, could there be a real chance. But you and I both know, Peter, that there's more chance of hell freezing over than of another party emerging. Likewise in Britain. Britain is dominated by the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. Unless that changes in Britain, unless that changes in America, then the situation we see in both countries will just continue indefinitely. It's been continuing like that over hundreds of years. Peter, nothing fundamentally changes in either Britain or America. Why? Because both those parties in America and Britain are part of the establishments, the British and the American respectively.
George, you and I talked about on the gaggle about how pleased we were that the DOJ was starting antitrust against Google. Unfortunately, in America, and probably in the UK too, you can't have antitrust against political parties, because I would be all for that, to break up those two big parties, because the fact of the matter is the most common political affiliation in the United States is non-affiliated, okay? The majority of the population of voting age is politically homeless, okay? And as long as they remain homeless, the status quo will be maintained, except for changes on the margins, okay? And it's all about, it's a celebrity politics is what it's about. Nobody wants to talk about the substance, because if you did, most people would pull out a pitchfork, and they should. Go ahead, George.
Yes, that's right. And it's kind of interesting that when third parties attempted to push their way into the United States, they were met with a ferocious opposition by the mainstream parties, which is they first of all tie them up in court, because it's quite hard to get on the ballot in the United States. You have to have 50,000 signatures or whatever, and then you could keep challenging these signatures. You take them to court and essentially bankrupt them. This would happen with Ross Perot. This would happen to Pat Buchanan. And then what you had in the case of Ralph Nader is a massive media barrage of hostility towards him. You know, how dare you run? How dare you take votes away from our progressive Democrats?
They still have
you know, you are. That's right, and they did that with Jill Stein, with the Greens. You are letting in Trump. You are working for Putin. This is clearly a Russian plot to bring Trump to power. So it is extremely hard for a third party. Harder than anywhere else. I mean, in other countries, third parties emerge without too much difficulty, but in the United States, almost impossible to do. But you're right. If you get a situation where people are homeless and are unable to express their desires, then violence is the likely outcome.
Unfortunately, we have to leave on that very depressing point. I want to thank my guests in Budapest and in London. I want to thank our viewers for watching us here at RT. See you next time. Remember, cross talk rules.